Imagine you're a 19-year-old woman who struggled with seizures and migraines for a few years. You know what's causing it. You've been diagnosed with it for a while. It's 2 tumors, one in the brain and another in the brainstem. They're so big and coiled so tightly that you fear becoming a vegetable if you get surgery. But you'll die if you don't get it. So you go around interviewing surgeons and doctors to see if there's any hope. However, not only are all of your doctors male and suggest that it may be pregnancy instead, despite the mountain of paperwork stating otherwise, but the only clinics you can have your surgery done at have a 1-star rating. This story sounds like it came from a Gothic horror novel from the 19th century, doesn't it? Well, as much as I wish it were, this is a real experience of what a friend of mine is going through right now. Despite the American medical industry having centuries to improve its treatment of women, there are hundreds of stories like hers from similar women in the 21st century. So let's spill the tea and talk about it. Okay. Hi there, my name is Megan Hummel and welcome to my discussion of how medical students, scholars, and physicians can utilize Gothic literature to examine Victorian representations of medical maltreatment against women, and in turn identify similar occurrences in today's medical industry. Because it explores darker themes and offers a window into the medical industry's 19th century scientific revolution, Gothic literature is a powerful resource for initiating this discussion. For this video, 4 pieces will be used to help focus our conversation. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. To start, I will examine each text for why it serves as a strong representation of medical maltreatment against women. Then, I will utilize current, real-life medical maltreatment accounts from women to verify how little the medical industry has evolved in its treatment of women over the past 2 centuries, and in turn, hopefully educate healthcare professionals on how they may do better. For Frankenstein, I would like to start us off by talking about Victor's mother. Victor's mother dies early in the novel after contracting scarlet fever. She serves as an example of what a Victorian-era female caregiver was expected to be: empathetic, compassionate, and self-sacrificing, an angel. She dies after nursing Elizabeth, Victor's adopted sister and future fiancé, back to health, and his love for her after her death can later be interpreted as the catalyst for his obsession with motherhood and creating life. However, Victor's accounts of his mother indicate that she lacked independence and originality, suggesting that this was typical for women during the era. This is mirrored by other women in Frankenstein. Whether this was how women acted in the era or were expected to act, they commonly adopted a sense of innocence and affection and lacked the ability to challenge those around them. Elizabeth, for instance, is a promised gift for Victor to marry one day. However, their relationship lacks a sense of passionate love, which may be why Victor resists the betrothal by delaying marriage for a couple of years. As upset and suspicious as Elizabeth is to Victor's delay, though, she's expected to remain kind and submissive. Otherwise, she risks becoming a figure of irritability and impatience, and this, of course, would not be an attractive trait for a woman in the Victorian era. This personality of hers ultimately becomes her downfall when Frankenstein's monster murders her, symbolizing how easy it is to silence and dispose of a compliant, submissive woman. This is further exemplified by Justine Moritz's story, who is framed for the murder of Victor's younger brother. Despite her innocence, the patriarchal legal system pressures her into a fake confession after being threatened with excommunication and hellfire. Ultimately, she is hanged, and Victor reflects on her suffering after failing to speak up for her innocence. However, his takeaway is that he remains the bigger victim, which establishes just how self-centered and egotistical he is. This plays into one of the major representations of medical misogyny in the book: his treatment of the monster's partner. For a big portion of Victor's story, he is terrorized by the monster because it wants what any person wants: a companion, someone to share its life with. So after numerous threats and blackmail, Victor finally gives in and begins assembling a female monster. As he nears his completion, however, he has a sudden wave of regret. He races to the worst conclusions possible, that creating a partner for the monster could lead to the reproduction of a hideous, monstrous new species, that if she were outside of his control, just like the original monster came to be, then it would mean pure horror and terror unleashed on the world. So, despite the alternative, more logical conclusion that he could just make her biologically infertile, he has a mental breakdown and rips and shreds apart the female body he's made. Victor's destruction could represent Victorian fears of female agency and how easy it was to erase all sense of morals to maintain a sense of control and power over women. Through these major instances, we see how Frankenstein reflects Victorian anxieties about women's independence and reproduction, and from Victor's perspective, how they can also serve as objects for male suffering. This could have fostered early expectations for women to remain passive and compliant as patients in the medical industry. Otherwise, if they were too loud and irritable, they were silenced and erased so the patriarchy could remain unthreatened, leaving them unable to advocate for themselves. This is why Frankenstein serves as a strong foundation to discuss medical maltreatment against women, because hints of this theme still remain today. Dracula is another example of a widely renowned Gothic story that reveals how women in the Victorian era were expected to be pure and innocent. If they weren't, they were abominations and evil beings. This is how Jonathan Harker, the character recounting his visit to Dracula's castle, describes the brides of Dracula, or the Weird Sisters. Their open sexual desire terrifies Jonathan, highlighting how unusual and almost threatening it was for women to be expressive and assertive in the Victorian era. This theme of purity and corruption is also displayed by the main female characters in the story, Lucy Westenra and Mina Harker. Lucy, Mina's friend and a highly sought-after bachelorette, is the first victim bitten by Dracula. At first, she is praised and desired for her beauty and purity, her name meaning light of the West. As she slowly turns, however, her suitors believe it to be the best course of action to try to pump her full of their own blood without her consent to try to save her. The suitors see themselves as her protectors and saviors, and Lucy is a passive patient open to their whims. In an era lacking informed consent laws, this represents how easy it was for doctors to have authority over women's bodies and the intense patriarchal fear for women to become corrupted and no longer pure. Then, Lucy dies. But her body is later identified by her grieving suitors to be roaming the earth once more, preying on young children. This version of her is strong, confident, and assertive of her sexual desire, terrifying her ex-suitors because she is no longer the passive, pure soul they once knew. But instead of locking her up and trying to determine a non-lethal solution, they decide to demonize her and purify through staking and decapitation. This only reinforces the idea that women were expected to be passive and valued for their purity and beauty. And if they stepped outside of that box, they suffered the mental and physical consequences. As the next victim, Mina Harker not only suffers from Dracula's violation of her mind and compulsion to drink his blood, but also suffers psychologically from Dr. Van Helsing's hypnosis. It is an exposing mental penetration used to manipulate her mental link with Dracula, similar to how Lucy's body was penetrated by the medical instrument to introduce foreign bodily fluids, the three suitors' blood. But the women accept it passively, as expected of them. Throughout Mina's process of turning, however, she believes she's been corrupted and is now impure, repeatedly calling herself unclean afterwards. Unlike Lucy, who's died after accepting the corruption and becoming a more assertive version of herself, Mina refuses it, remaining passive, and later survives when the suitors take the fight to Dracula. This reinforces how meek and susceptible women were expected to be in the Victorian era, believing they needed a savior to evade corruption and further harm. Act like Mina, and the healthcare system will come to your rescue. If you don't, then it can't save you. As a whole, Dracula represents several examples of the idealization of pure women, and accordingly, the demonization of impure and sexually assertive women. It unveils the Victorian battleground of male control over women's bodies, with the struggle of using non-consensual and exposing medical procedures to win. It also revealed Victorian fears against the idea of the new woman that was growing in popularity at the time. A woman who was confident in herself and challenged traditional gender norms. This is why Dracula serves as a significant resource to discuss medical maltreatment against women, because unfortunately, there are still gender power struggles and obstacles for decisive women in the medical field present today. While The Fall of the House of Usher is not as widely renowned as Frankenstein or Dracula, it is another captivating vampire tale that presents an ailing woman named Madeline Usher and her twin brother, Roderick Usher. As Madeline suffers from her illness, she is described as being part of the background, silent, frail, and almost ghostly. But despite her silence, her sickness parallels her brother's, but his has taken the shape of madness and outward despair. This establishes an early interpretation that, despite experiencing the same illness, women tend to be quieter and keep to themselves more when sick than men do. This bottled up pain, however, later weakens their bodies from the inside out. This shows how normal it was for women in the Victorian era to hide their pain, despite the physical and mental dangers of doing so. The audience learns this information about Madeline through Roderick, who talks to his friend, the narrator of the story. He also shares what he believes their diagnosis is. However, the information is presented solely through his lens and lacks any real details from his sister. This indicates his diagnosis is likely incorrect since his facts aren't verified. He's an unreliable narrator. The lack of fact-checking would potentially explain the premature burial that then shortly happens. They think Madeline dies, they bury her without confirming her death, and Roderick later confesses to hearing noises from the tomb days after. His hasty burial of her could be interpreted in several ways. He wanted to rid himself of a piece of his identity, he lacked moral responsibility, or he felt guilty at silencing her. One way or another, it demonstrates the lack of proper medical evaluation of women. It can also illuminate the idea that for very sick women, those treating them may dehumanize them as they wait for them to die. Her brother's insolence plants the seeds for Madeline's fury, where she rises from the tomb for her revenge. Her final act as a potential undead is violent. She kills her brother and destroys the house, ultimately ending the patriarchal Usher family name. It represents the repression of womanhood fighting back, because she would never accept such disgrace of her body. But her ultimate demise shows that even when women fight back, they are not guaranteed hope that the treatment of women will change. All in all, The Fall of the House of Usher is a fascinating Gothic work with several depictions of medical maltreatment. These primarily include a lack of proper evaluation of patient symptoms, especially for female patients who may have a higher pain tolerance and may be quieter about it than others. There may be increased difficulty on the physician's end in treating these silent women because they may lack the agency to voice any troubles or concerns until it's too late. There is also the fear that for very sick women, they can be thought of as long dead by those waiting for them to die and treated as such. Overall, this is why The Fall of the House of Usher serves as a key resource for evaluating medical maltreatment against women, as complaints of similar occurrences still exist today. Framed from the narrative of a new mother, The Yellow Wallpaper is arguably the strongest Gothic critique of medical maltreatment. When the narrator suffers from postpartum depression, her physician husband insists that Dr. Silas Ware Mitchell's rest cure is the proper remedy and confines her to a former nursery. His superficial triage and dismissal of her concerns reflect the trivialization of mental health concerns in the Victorian era, where genuine psychological distress was often ignored or misdiagnosed. The treatment also mirrors the real, distressing regimen the author endured, in which she tried to shock her doctor into changing the treatment of women with this very story. The shift to the nursery, with its barred windows and repulsive wallpaper, is a physical representation of the patriarchy dictating the narrator's life, which she resists from the beginning. Her husband dismisses her resistance, insisting it is for her own good. Treating her more like a child than a patient, he denies her autonomy by confining her physically and psychologically, suggesting that women had difficulty retaining their autonomy in the Victorian era. As the narrator struggles with boredom and isolation, she begins journaling in secret. Despite her husband forbidding her to work, thinking it would speed her recovery, she cannot endure the suppression of her creative and intellectual nature, especially since creative expression often supports healing. His prohibition, paired with his 23-hour control, when she sleeps, eats, or sees visitors, which she doesn't, reveals how medical authority can transform into a tool for domination and patriarchal control. Trapped in this stifling environment, the narrator grows fixated on the wallpaper she previously despised, describing the experience as seeing a woman trapped within it. Then, as the short story reaches its climax, the trapped figure tears through the paper to free herself, and John, her husband, is suggested as either fainting at the sight of the wallpaper woman walking around or is implied to be murdered by his now unhinged wife. Either way, it underscores the disastrous consequences of only treating women's psychological distress with physical remedies. In summary, the Yellow Wallpaper exhibits how a medical environment that is not understanding or sympathetic to women who are struggling with mental health disorders can be harmful to their well-being. The narrator would have greatly benefited if her husband had done a more careful analysis of her mind and body, but instead, he allowed Victorian society's stigma against mental health to govern his decision to isolate her socially and creatively. In this way, the Yellow Wallpaper is a fantastic source for discussing medical maltreatment against women because negligence like so continues to appear in the modern medical world. Overall, these texts provide insights into how women were treated in death or near-death scenarios, how doctors dealt with a woman's mental affliction, and how a woman's lack of autonomy regarding medical treatment and well-being affected their health during the Victorian era. Since the American medical industry largely adopted European traditions, they also serve as insightful reflections on how the American medical industry in the 19th century treated women, which, for the purposes of this video, is also being referred to as the Victorian era. While historians claim that the 19th century was a prosperous time of industrial transformation marked by several newfound science-based practices, it arguably overlooked advances in patient-centered care and treatment for women. This has trickled down to impact the current medical industry in the United States, where women of the 21st century claim they are experiencing a lack of proper medical care from their medical providers. So, what does this look like? Well, as seen in the Gothic literature analysis, there were common themes reflecting how women were treated. The silencing of women's voices, the control of their bodies and autonomy, the shift from idealization to demonization of women when they are not passive or compliant patients, and a struggle in resisting the patriarchal control when they become aware of it. However, these 19th century Gothic themes remain prevalent today. According to a 2020 study which surveyed women who recently gave birth in New York, Kansas, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Virginia, about 1 in 8 women reported mistreatment during childbirth, but their requests for help went ignored. A researcher from Columbia University explained that it was due to the social stigma involved with the birth experience, which would change the delivery of healthcare. The 2024 Kaiser Family Foundation study, with over 5,000 women included, found that nearly 1 in 4 women ages 18 to 64 report that a healthcare provider or staff member was unfair or disrespectful. It goes on to identify that within 2 years, 20% of women experienced a provider ignoring a direct request or question. 19% had a provider assume something about them without asking, 17% were accused of not telling the truth, 13% were blamed for their health problem, and 10% had refusals to prescribe much-needed pain medication. And this is a problem even celebrities experience. Lupita Nyong'o, who plays Nakia in the popular Marvel's Black Panther movies, and as Helen of Troy in the upcoming 2026 movie The Odyssey by Christopher Nolan, shares her experience of having 30 fibroids removed. She describes her diagnosis of long-term uterine fibroids as being widely misunderstood, where she was left with doctors who tried to normalize or downplay her pain, making her feel lost and confused about her condition. Because of the lack of knowledge, a hysterectomy, a major invasive surgery, is pressured by doctors as the first choice of treatment, even though less invasive treatments are available. As a condition that 70 to 80% of American women have by their 50s, this is one among many major healthcare concerns for women that are drastically under-researched and underfunded, which can hinder safe and principled medical treatment for them. In a similar vein, the Michigan Chronicle reported that the stories of 3 Detroit women who suffered the consequences of being ignored and silenced by the healthcare system were published last September. Their pain was downplayed, disbelieved, and doubted, which caused the women irreversible damage as their health significantly declined shortly after. They had wanted something done from the very beginning, but their autonomy had been disregarded, and now they struggled with bone infections, stage 4 ulcers, surgeries, and permanent blindness that could have been avoided. As reported by attorney Dion Webster Cox, their legal representative, it's not just about negligence, but also about dignity and systematic failure in the healthcare system to protect and care for our elderly women, as this pattern extends from hospitals, specialty clinics, gynecology offices, and others in Michigan and beyond. The real tragedy is that if a female patient is not passive or compliant and tries to speak up for themselves, they may be labeled as emotional and hysterical by the healthcare staff. And according to MD Links, this can be added to a patient's permanent healthcare record, which follows them everywhere and is likely to impede future care they receive. But this can stem from patients feeling that their healthcare providers doubt their concerns, leading them to feel they have to prove their symptoms, according to the American Cancer Society. So, for expressing their concerns more, they are demonized by the healthcare providers around them, like the women from the Gothic pieces were. This could explain why, according to Soliant Health's 2024 State of Healthcare report, women were reported to be 66.1% more likely to have a misdiagnosis than men in the last 2 years. Furthermore, women who recognize this systemic gender bias in the healthcare system try to balance being assertive and knowledgeable, yet also complicit and respectful advocates for themselves. Medical Express reports that in a 2023 study from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, women with under-researched medical conditions had to collect their own records and advocate for themselves without being too assertive, fearing further medical dehumanization. They were treated dismissively by their physicians, and fighting patriarchal medical control with evidence they personally tracked and collected is their best defense. If the patient is rational and controlled, however, this could also lead healthcare providers to believe that there is nothing wrong. So, whether a woman is assertive and loud or quiet and gently questioning about her condition, the risk that they'll be mistreated, even in an emergency, remains strong. This highlights why medical providers and students need to reevaluate what medical negligence and mistreatment look like in the industry. Otherwise, it can continue to set a dangerous precipice in the treatment of female patients. We need to continue to advance and revolutionize the medical industry in terms of gender-specific care and treatment, because the continuing reports from women who are not satisfied with their healthcare are alarming. We've seen these themes of 19th century medical mistreatment in Gothic literature, so it's about time we changed the United States medical industry to move beyond this. This is also why using Gothic literature, such as the text I previously analyzed, can be an excellent way to introduce the topic to students and healthcare providers in an engaging and easily digestible way, especially given the reflective insight that this struggle has been ongoing for about 2 centuries. Widespread social biases in a given time period are expected to appear in the literature at that time, and by investigating popular literature first, we can use it as a reflective lens to assess the prominence of the current situation. With the next generation of medical professionals, we need to encourage increased awareness of how female patients are treated, enhance education on what maltreatment against women looks like, establish proper etiquette on how to speak with women struggling with mental health or those with a high pain tolerance, and overall, provide women with a comfortable medical environment they can rely on. Ultimately, introducing this need with popular Gothic literature can not only inspire a philosophical and engaging discussion on how we can do this, but also a creative and empathetic alternative to the science-driven landscape of contemporary healthcare. Yeah, that was some good tea. I'm Megan Hummel, and this was on using Gothic literature to discuss medical maltreatment against women. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching.